Misty here with Chapter 3 of To Kill a Mockingbird. So yesterday we read about Scout's first day of school. Very disappointing for her. She got in trouble a couple times with Miss Caroline for already knowing how to read, for knowing how to write, also write in cursive, for trying to explain why Walter Cunningham can't borrow a quarter from her. And so Chapter 2 ends with Scout in the corner after getting spanked, and the bell rings. She's literally saved by the bell. It's time to go to lunch. And as Scout's leaving, she sees Miss Caroline sort of exasperated, put her head down on her desk, and Scout says, had her conduct been more friendly toward me, I would have felt sorry for her. She was a pretty little thing. So Chapter 3 picks up right there. Scout's really just exiting the classroom, going into the schoolyard, chasing Walter Cunningham down because she believes that he is the one responsible for her starting off on the wrong foot with Miss Caroline. Catching Walter Cunningham in the schoolyard gave me some pleasure. When I was rubbing his nose in the dirt, Jim came by and told me to stop. "You're bigger than he is," he said. "He's as old as you, nearly," I said. "He made me start off on the wrong foot." "Let him go, Scout." "Why?" "He didn't have any lunch," I said, and explained my involvement in Walter's dietary affairs. Walter had picked himself up and was standing quietly listening to Jim and me. His fists were half-cocked, as if expecting an onslaught from both of us. I stomped at him and chased him away, but Jim put out his hand and stopped me. He examined Walter with an air of speculation. "Your daddy, Mr. Walter Cunningham from Old Sarm?" he asked, and Walter nodded. Walter looked as if he'd been raised on fish food. His eyes, as blue as Dill Harris's, were red-rimmed and watery. There was no color in his face except the tip of his nose, which was moistly pink. He fingered the straps of his overalls, nervously picking at the metal hooks. Jim suddenly grinned at him. "Come on home to dinner with us, Walter," he said. "We'd be glad to have you." Walter's face brightened, then darkened. Jim said, "Our daddy's a friend of your daddy's. Scout here, she's crazy. She won't fight you anymore." "I wouldn't be too certain of that," I said. Jim's free dispensation of my pledge irked me. The precious noontime minutes were slipping away. "Hey, Walter, I won't jump on you again. Don't you like butter beans? Our cow's a real good cook." Walter stood where he was, biting his lip. Jim and I gave up. We were nearly to the Radley place when Walter called, "Hey, I'm coming." When Walter caught up with us, Jim made pleasant conversation with him. "A Haint lives there," he said cordially, pointing to the Radley house. "Ever hear about him, Walter?" "Reckon I have," said Walter. "Almost died the first year I come to school and ate them pecans. Folks said he poisoned them and put him over the school side of the fence." Jim seemed to have little fear of Boo Radley now that Walter and I walked beside him. Indeed, Jim grew boastful. "I went all the way up to the house once," he said to Walter. "Anybody who went up to the house once ought to not to still run every time he passes it," I said to the clouds above. "And who's running, Miss Priss?" "You are when ain't anybody with you." By the time we reached our front steps, Walter had forgotten he was a Cunningham. Jim ran to the kitchen and asked Calpurnia to set an extra plate. We had company. Atticus greeted Walter and began a discussion about crops neither Jim nor I could follow. "Reason I can't pass the first grade, Mr. Finch, is I've had to stay out every spring and help Papa with the chopping, but there's another one at the house now that's field size." "Did you pay a bushel of potatoes for him?" I asked, but Atticus shook his head at me. While Walter piled food on his plate, he and Atticus talked together like two men, to the wonderment of Jim and me. Atticus was expounding upon farm problems when Walter interrupted to ask if there was any molasses in the house. Atticus summoned Calpurnia, who returned bearing the syrup pitcher. She stood waiting for Walter to help himself. Walter poured syrup on his vegetables and meat with a generous hand. He would probably have poured it into his milk glass had I not asked what the Sam Hill he was doing. The silver saucer clattered when he replaced the pitcher, and he quickly put his hands in his lap. Then he ducked his head. Atticus shook his head at me again. "But he's gone and drowned his dinner in syrup," I protested. "He's poured it all over." It was then that Calpurnia requested my presence in the kitchen. She was furious, and when she was furious, Calpurnia's grammar became erratic. When in tranquility, her grammar was as good as anybody in Macomb. Atticus said Calpurnia had more education than most colored folks. When she squinted down at me, the tiny lines around her eyes deepened. "There's some folks who don't eat like us," she whispered fiercely, "but you ain't called on to contradict them at the table and they don't. That boy's your company, and if he wants to eat at the tablecloth, you let him, you hear?" "He ain't company, cow. He's just a Cunningham." "Hush your mouth. Don't matter who they are. Anybody sets foot in this house, you're company. And don't you let me catch you remarking on their ways like you was so high and mighty. You folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but it don't count for nothing the way you disgrace them. And if you can't act fit to eat at the table, you can just sit here and eat in the kitchen." Calpurnia sent me through the swinging door to the dining room with a stinging smack. I retrieved my plate and finished dinner in the kitchen, thankful, though, that I was spared the humiliation of facing them again. I told Calpurnia to just wait. I'd fix her. One of these days when she wasn't looking, I'd go off and drown myself in Barker's Edie, and then she'd be sorry. Besides, I added, she'd already got me in trouble once today. She taught me to write, and it was all her fault. "Hush your fussing," she said. So this little incident with Walter Cunningham, we know Walter Cunningham comes from a very poor family, a farm family, and if you were just trying to survive, syrup is not a luxury. Any kind of sweet thing is not a thing that you would have. But Walter's still a child, and just like kids love candy, he wants some syrup. And Harper Lee is really starting to establish, and we'll see later, this sort of caste system that exists in Maycomb, and that even when Calpurnia says your folks might be better than the Cunninghams, that there's this rank, that there's the Finches and the Cunninghams and people like the Yules, and it's just sort of this established belief in town that these certain families are better than others, and that'll be a thing that Scout and Jim explore, and that Harper Lee explores with the reader, what makes people good folks. Jim and Walter returned to school ahead of me. Staying behind to advise Atticus of Calpurnia's iniquities was worth a solitary sprint past the Radley place. She likes Jim better than she likes me anyway, I concluded, and suggested that Atticus lose no time in packing her off. Have you ever considered that Jim doesn't worry her half as much? Atticus's voice was flinty. I've no intention of getting rid of her, now or ever. We couldn't operate a single day without Cal. Have you ever thought of that? You think about how much Cal does for you. Any mantra you hear? I returned to school and hated Calpurnia steadily until a sudden shriek shattered my resentments. I looked up to see Miss Caroline standing in the middle of the room, sheer horror flooding her face. Apparently she had revived enough to persevere in her profession. It's alive, she screamed. The male population of the class rushed as one to her assistance. Lord, I thought, she's scared of a mouse. Little Chuck Little, whose patience with all living things was phenomenal, said, Which way to go, Miss Caroline? Tell us where he went, quick. D.C., he turned to a boy behind him. D.C., shut the door and we'll catch him. Quick, ma'am, where'd he go? Miss Caroline pointed a shaking figure not at the floor, nor at a desk, but to a hulking individual unknown to me. Little Chuck's face contracted, and he said gently, You mean him, ma'am? Like she's pointing at a student. You mean him, ma'am? Well, yes, he's alive. Did he scare you some way? Miss Caroline said desperately, I was walking by when it crawled out of his hair. It just crawled out of his hair. Little Chuck grinned broadly. There ain't no need to fear a cootie, ma'am. Ain't you ever seen one? Now don't you be afraid. You just go back to your desk and teach us some more. So she saw like lice in this kid's hair. Little Chuck Little was another member of the population who didn't know where his next meal was coming from, but he was a born gentleman. He put his hand under her elbow and led Miss Caroline to the front of the room. Now don't you fret, ma'am, he said. There ain't no need to fear a cootie. I'll just fetch you some cool water. The cootie's host, meaning the student, showed not the faintest interest in the furor he had wrought. He searched the scalp above his forehead, located his guest, and pinched it between his thumb and forefinger. Miss Caroline watched the process in horrid fascination. Little Chuck brought water in a paper cup, and she drank it gratefully. Finally, she found her voice. What is your name, son? She asked softly. The boy blinked. Who, me? Miss Caroline nodded. Burris Yule. No, that Yule name you've heard in Chapter 1. Miss Caroline inspected her roll book. I have a Yule here, but I don't have a first name. Would you spell your first name for me? Don't know how. They call me Burris at home. Well, Burris, said Miss Caroline, I think we'd better excuse you for the rest of the afternoon. I want you to go home and wash your hair. From her desk, she produced a thick volume, leafed through its pages, and read for a moment. A good home remedy for... Burris, I want you to go home and wash your hair with lye soap. When you've done that, treat your scalp with kerosene. What for, missus? To get rid of the, cooties. You see, Burris, the other children might catch them, and you wouldn't want that, would you? The boy stood up. He was the filthiest human I had ever seen. His neck was dark gray. The backs of his hands were rusty, and his fingernails were black deep into the quick. He peered at Miss Caroline from a fist-sized clean space on his face. No one had noticed him, probably, because Miss Caroline and I had entertained the class most of the morning. And Burris, said Miss Caroline, please bathe yourself before you come back tomorrow. The boy laughed rudely. You ain't sending me home, missus. I was on the verge of leaving. I done my time for this year. Miss Caroline looked puzzled. What do you mean by that? The boy did not answer. He gave a short, contemptuous snort. One of the elderly members of the class answered her. He's one of the Yules, ma'am. And I wondered if this explanation would be as unsuccessful as my attempt. But Miss Caroline seemed willing to listen. Whole school's full of 'em. They come first day every year and then leave. The truant lady gets 'em here because she threatens 'em with the sheriff. But she's given up trying to hold 'em. She reckons she's carried out the law, just getting their names on the roll and running them here the first day. You're supposed to mark 'em absent the rest of the year. But what about their parents? Asked Miss Caroline in genuine concern. Ain't got no mother, was the answer, and their pa is right contentious. Burris Yule was flattered by the recital. I've been coming to the first day of the first grade for 3 years now, he said expansively. Reckon if I'm smart this year, they'll promote me to the second. Miss Caroline said, sit back down, please, Burris. And the moment she said it, I knew she had made a serious mistake. The boy's condescension flashed to anger. You try and make me, missus. Little Chuck Little got to his feet. "Let him go, ma'am," he said. "He's a mean one, a hard-down mean one. He's liable to start something, and there's some little folks here." He was among the most diminutive of men, meaning little himself. But when Burris Schul turned toward him, Little Chuck's right hand went to his pocket. "Watch your step, Burris," he said. "I'd soon kill you as look at you. Now go home." Burris seemed to be afraid of a child half his height, and Miss Caroline took advantage of his indecision. "Burris, go home. If you don't, I'll call the principal," she said. "I have to report this anyway." The boy snorted and slouched leisurely to the door. Safely out of range, she turned and shouted, "Report and be damned to ye! Ain't no snot-nosed slut of a school teacher ever born can make me do nothing. You ain't making me go nowhere, missus. You just remember that. You ain't making me go nowhere." He waited until he was sure she was crying. Then he shuffled out of the building. Soon we were clustered around her desk, trying in our various ways to comfort her. "He is a real mean one. That's below the belt. You ain't called on to teach folks like that. Them ain't Makeham's ways, Miss Caroline, not really. Now don't you fret, ma'am. Miss Caroline, why don't you read us a story? The cat thing was real fine this morning." Miss Caroline smiled, blew her nose, and said, "Thank you, darlings." Dispersed us, opened a book, and mystified the first grade with a long narrative about a toad frog that lived in a hall. When I passed the Radley place for the fourth time that day, twice at a full gallop, my gloom had deepened to match the house. If the remainder of the school year were as fraught with drama as the first day, perhaps it would be mildly entertaining. But the prospect of spending 9 months refraining from reading and writing made me think of running away. By late afternoon, most of my traveling plans were complete. When Jim and I raced each other up the sidewalk to meet Atticus coming home from work, I didn't give him much of a race. It was our habit to run meet Atticus the moment we saw him round the post office corner in the distance. Atticus seemed to have forgotten my noontime fall from grace. He was full of questions about school. My replies were monosyllabic, and he did not press me. Perhaps Calpurnia sensed that my day had been a grim one. She let me watch her fix supper. "Shut your eyes and open your mouth and I'll give you a surprise," she said. It was not often that she made crackling bread. She said she never had time. With both of us at school today had been an easy one for her. She knew I loved crackling bread. Crackling bread's kind of like monkey bread. You pull the pieces off, and it's like brown sugar and cinnamon. It's delicious. "I miss you today," she said. "The house got so lonesome long about 2 o'clock I had to turn on the radio." "Why? Jim and me ain't ever in the house unless it's raining." "I know," she said, "but one of you's always in calling distance. I wonder how much of the day I spend just calling after you." "Well," she said, getting up from the kitchen chair, "it's enough time to make a pan of crackling bread, I reckon. You run along now and let me get supper on the table." Calpurnia bent down and kissed me. I ran along, wondering what had come over her. She wanted to make up with me, that was it. She had always been too hard on me. She had at last seen the error of her fractious ways. She was sorry and too stubborn to say so, and I was weary from the day's crimes. After supper, Atticus sat down with the paper and called, "Scout, ready to read?" The Lord sent me more than I could bear, and I went to the front porch. Atticus followed me. So remember, in chapter 2, Miss Caroline had told Scout to tell Atticus to quit teaching her. So that's what she says, "The Lord sent me more than I can bear," because she thinks that she's not supposed to keep reading with her dad. I told Atticus I didn't feel very well and didn't think I'd go to school anymore if it was all right with him. Atticus sat down on the swing and crossed his legs. His fingers wandered to his watch pocket, and he said that was the only way he could think. He waited in amiable silence, and I sought to reinforce my position. "You never went to school, and you do all right, so I'll just stay home too. You can teach me like Granddaddy taught you and Uncle Jack." "No, I can't," said Atticus. "I have to make a living. Besides, they'd put me in jail if I kept you at home. Dose of magnesia for you tonight and school tomorrow." "I'm feeling all right, really." "I thought so. Now what's the matter?" Bit by bit, I told him the day's misfortunes. "And she said you taught me all wrong, so we can't ever read any more, ever. Please don't send me back, please, sir." Atticus stood up and walked to the end of the porch. When he completed his examination of the wisteria vine, he strolled back to me. "First of all," he said, "if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kind of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view." "Sir?" "Until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." This is going to be just an essential part of the novel, and a topic, I should say, that Harper Lee explores, to the end of the novel, is just to be able to put yourself in other people's perspectives. And a lot of times we get people confused and judge them wrong because we misread their motivations. Just that Scout feels like Miss Caroline's the enemy here, or she thinks Calpurnia's too hard on her, or all the just misperceptions that she's had even just on this one day. Atticus is going to teach her starting now and to continue for the rest of her life to put herself in other people's shoes, to climb around their skin, look at things from their perspective, and that can often, lead to Scout being able to understand people better, and that's true of us as the reader as well. Atticus said I'd learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned several things herself. She had learned not to hand something to a Cunningham for one thing, but if Walter and I had put ourselves in her shoes, we'd have seen it was an honest mistake on her part. We could not expect her to learn all Maycomb's ways in one day. We could not hold her responsible when she knew no better. I'll be dogged, I said. I didn't know no better than not to read to her. She held me responsible. Listen, Atticus, I don't have to go to school. I was bursting with a sudden thought. But you'll remember, he just goes to school the first day. The truant lady reckons she's carried out the law when she gets his name on the roll. You can't do that, Scout, Atticus said. Sometimes it's better to bend the law a little in special cases. In your case, the law remains rigid, so to school you must go. I don't see why I have to and he doesn't. Well, then listen. Atticus said the Yules had been the disgrace of Maycomb for 3 generations. None of them had done an honest day's work in his recollection. He said that some Christmas, when he was getting rid of the tree, he would take me with him and show me where and how they lived. They were people, but they lived like animals. They can go to school any time they want to, when they show the faintest symptoms of wanting an education, said Atticus. There are ways of keeping them in school by force, but it's silly to force people like the Yules into a new environment. If I didn't go to school tomorrow, you'd force me to. Let us leave it at this, said Atticus dryly. You, Miss Scoutfinch, are the common folk. You must obey the law. He said that the Yules were members of an exclusive society made up of Yules. In certain circumstances, the common folk judiciously allowed them certain privileges by the simple method of becoming blind to some of the Yules' activities. They didn't have to go to school for one thing. Another thing, Mr. Bob Yule, Burris's father, was permitted to hunt and trap out of season. Atticus, that's bad, I said. And Maycomb County hunting out of season was a misdemeanor at law, a capital felony in the eyes of the populace. It's against the law, all right, said my father, and it's certainly bad. When a man spends his relief checks on green whiskey, his children have a way of crying from hunger pains. I don't know of any landowner around here who begrudges those children any game their father can hit. Mr. Yule shouldn't do that. Of course he shouldn't. But he'll never change his ways. Are you going to take out your disapproval on his children? No, sir, I murmured, and made a final stand. But if I keep on going to school, we can't ever read any more. That's really bothering you, isn't it? Yes, sir. When Atticus looked down at me, I saw the expression on his face that always made me expect something. Do you know what a compromise is? He asked. Bending the law? No, an agreement reached by mutual concession. It works this way, he said. If you'll concede the necessity of going to school, we'll go on reading every night just as we always have. Is it a bargain? Yes, sir. We'll consider it sealed without the usual formality, Atticus said when he saw me preparing to spit. As I opened the front screen door, Atticus said, By the way, Scout, you better not say anything at school about our agreement. Why not? I'm afraid our activities would be received with considerable disapprobation by the more learned authorities. Jim and I were accustomed to our father's last will and testament diction, and we were at all times free to interpret Atticus for a translation when it was beyond our understanding. Huh, sir? I never went to school, he said, but I have a feeling that if you tell Miss Caroline we read every night, she'll get after me, and I don't want her after me. Atticus kept us in fits that evening, gravely reading columns of print about a man who sat on a flagpole for no discernible reason, which was reason enough for Jim to spend the following Saturday aloft in the tree house. Jim sat from after breakfast until sunset, and what had remained overnight had not Atticus severed his supply lines. I had spent most of the day climbing up and down, running errands for him, providing him with literature, nourishment, and water, and was carrying him blankets for the night when Atticus said if I paid no attention to him, Jim would come down. Atticus was right. I love this chapter so much. This is not no slut of a school teacher. It's hilarious. And also, normally when we do this activity in class, I'll do like a poll of my students and ask how many of you, raise your hand or check the box, whatever I decided to do that day, if you agree that people on welfare or food stamps should have to take a drug test. And almost the whole class, everybody says yes. Of course, certainly you should say they should have to take a drug test. And then after we read this chapter, I ask them again. Mm-hmm. And most of the class at that point disagree because we don't realize that, and even when writing's not necessarily political, literature can change the way that we think about the world. And even just that example of, are you going to punish Bob Yule's kids for his misbehavior, for something that you don't agree with? You're going to punish the children for it. It's the kind of same along those lines. Well, if someone has to take a drug test before they can get their welfare money, what if they have kids? Then you're punishing their kids too for their parents' misactions. So it's just a neat thing about literature. But anyway, we'll get to chapter 4 tomorrow, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye.